This video is sponsored by Epidemic Sound.
Like a lot of photographers will probably be able to say, photography has been a really big part of my life, since I was a kid. But from playing around with my parents' cameras to finally being able to call myself a full-time photographer, there have definitely been a lot of different steps in between. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at some of those steps, kind of like my journey as a photographer and how I turned a hobby into what is now my career. For those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Sophia Carey. I am a photographer based in the UK. I mostly specialise in portrait and music. I also make videos here on YouTube, ranging from everything from film photography to running your business as a creative, as a photographer. But let's get stuck into the video. So I started my photography career aged 16, so I was pretty young. And because of that, I think it would be safe to assume that I always knew I was going to be a photographer. I always wanted to be a photographer. But that wasn't really ever true. I was always really creative. As a kid, I was really into drawing. I was really into art. I was really into writing, writing stories and stuff like that. So I was definitely always creative, but I didn't want to be a photographer. That was just kind of something that I did. I just took photos like anyone did. As a young teenager, I played around a lot with how to monetize your creative passions and doing commissions for drawings and graphic design and stuff like that. And then I ended up going to college where I studied graphic design alongside a couple of other subjects. And then eventually onto uni where I studied graphic design as well. So as a graphic designer, a lot of your work ends up utilizing photography. So, maybe you're doing a poster or some sort of layout design. A lot of the time you're going to need photos to put into that. And I spent a lot of my time kind of searching for stock imagery. And I decided to take my own photos for those designs rather than using stock imagery. If we're going right back, the cameras that I would be using would be the little digital plasticky ones that are coming back in fashion now. Those kind of digital cameras. And then after that, I kind of started getting into photography a little bit more, I used my mum's Olympus C8080, something like that. And that was a little bit more like a DSLR. It had a little bit more control. I think I was particularly interested in capturing texture, in capturing depth, because there was now this camera that could capture that. Whereas, those little plasticky point and shoots, they don't really have that capability. And then later I started being a little bit more interested in things like street photography, documenting people, documenting places. And then a couple of years on, after this initial exploration of photography, I got what I really do consider to be my first camera, and that was the Canon EOS 650D, which is a crop sensor Canon camera. And from practicing, learning how to shoot in manual with that camera, to taking on my first ever paid shoots. And at this point I was still really into street photography, and I was using the kit lens, which I think was an 18-55 if I remember rightly. And I hadn't really ever kind of delved into portraiture until I went with my friends who were kind of performing at an event around South London where I was growing up, and I started doing behind the scenes stuff and behind the scenes portraits, taking photos of them performing on stage. And from then on I just kind of carried on doing that. I would go to gigs, I would go to gigs that my friends were performing in, gigs that my friends weren't performing in, taking my camera, meeting people, getting to know people. I'd end up shooting stuff behind the scenes or music videos, and just kind of throwing myself into photography and what you could kind of do within that sphere. Around this time is when I purchased the Nifty 50. That was the first lens I ever got that wasn't the kit lens. It's a great lens because it performs really well. It's got nice kind of wide aperture. It's a fast lens, but it's a fraction of the cost of other lenses. And with this lens, my interest in portraiture definitely grew. I continued taking portraits of friends and family, practicing portraiture, trying to understand a little bit more about shooting manual and different lighting techniques and stuff like that. And then from attending more and more events, I would meet more and more people. People would message me on Instagram. I'd get a little bit of interest in people paying me to take their photo, to take their portrait, mostly models that were just starting out or musicians who needed press photos and stuff like that. So I started charging a small hourly fee. I think my first couple of shoots were charged at something ridiculous, 30 quid. I think that figure actually came from the first shoot I ever did that I didn't really know that you could get paid, so I didn't go into it kind of expecting money, and the model gave me just kind of, I guess, the change in their pocket. I don't know what it was, but it was a mixture of coins and notes, and it amounted to about 30 quid. So when I started charging for things, I was like, oh, they paid me 30 quid, so I'll just kind of start off with that price. and I did like £30 an hour shoots for a little while. And then after like a year or so of doing like small shoots and like incrementally increasing my price as I'm like, okay, £30, maybe that's a bit low, learning a bit more about business, maybe then I'd go up to like £40 an hour or £50 an hour. And like after about a year of doing stuff like this, me and my friend that I went to college with decided that what London really, really needed back in 2017 or whenever it was another arts and culture music magazine. And so we started one. I think that starting this magazine actually really did teach me a lot about business. It taught me about cash flow, it taught me about like reaching out to people, pitching, like all of those sorts of things, about marketing things on social media. We only ever did one print run, but that kind of whole experience of doing that over the couple of months that we ran that, about half a year, I think was very important in kind of learning that you could make money from photography and learning how to go about it and how to communicate with people who really didn't know what they were doing. Like alongside studying graphic design at college, I also studied media and business. I was lucky enough to have some really great tutors at college who invested their time into me and would help me and give me advice and teach me about VAT and teach me about, like I said, cash flow charts and stuff like that. So that was really very instrumental. I think the time in which I was running that magazine or running that magazine came at a really good time because I had that support of still being in education and still having people that I could kind of ask and I guess rely on. But we ended up photographing some really amazing people for that magazine, some of which are still in my life today. And it also was a great tool when it came to networking, getting my name out a little bit at that time. But that summer that we started the magazine was quite a turning point for me. It was probably the period of time where I realised that I could maybe make something out of photography. That summer also bought Parklife Festival, which was the first festival I ever attended, and me and my friends got the coach up to Manchester. We went to Parklife. I took my Canon EOS 650D and my Nifty 50. I don't think they even knew it was like a real camera because it was such like a small compact thing. And I managed to get it to like the front of every crowd, taking photos of like different artists and stuff like that. And that's a really weird full circle moment for me now because, you know, that didn't actually do anything for my career. Doing that didn't do anything for my career other than give me experience. But, you know, for the last 2 years, I've actually shot Parklife Festival for the festival as part of their media team. So that's a really weird full circle kind of memory for me. This was also the summer that I decided that I actually really needed to learn how to edit my photos properly because I'd just been using VSCO or however you say it, which I love. It's a great platform and I still use it for like, you know, like iPhone photography and stuff like that. But yeah, that was kind of the extent of my editing knowledge. So I thought it's time to learn Adobe Lightroom. I already had a little bit of Photoshop experience from doing graphic design, but Lightroom was like a whole new thing for me, and learning how to grade in Lightroom definitely was another turning point for me. I also started to shoot weddings during this period, which was like a crazy thing to be doing at like age 17, but it kind of came about in a really weird way. I was actually in business, in my class in business, and I saw an advert on Facebook and they were looking for student photographers who would shoot for this new agency that were offering really low prices to people who were trying to find photographers on a budget. You know, at the time I didn't really realise how much work was going to be needed to go into wedding photography, how much pressure it was and all of that stuff. So I was also working like a minimum wage part-time job alongside my studies, so the money seemed amazing, but you know, now in reflection you can kind of see, you know, it wasn't that great. But I definitely think that was one instance where naivety kind of worked to my favour, because if I had known how much work shooting a wedding was, I maybe would not have gone into it with so much confidence. Thankfully, I was still able to create work that the clients liked, the couples liked, and so everything was all good. I just kind of had to learn on the job and was still able to meet that standard that people wanted from their wedding day. And that taught me, again, a lot about business and a lot about photography, because when you do wedding photography, you have to be able to do everything. You have to be able to do events, you have to work in low light, you have to be able to do candid stuff, pose stuff, portraiture. There's literally like every kind of photography rolled into one. It is really like a crash course on what you need to know as a photographer. Another definite defining point for me that was also within this same summer, this same period of time, was that I landed my first ever commercial job. And this first commercial job was great because it taught me kind of how much maybe you should be charging, and also it gave me an insight into things like licensing fees. But even at that point, even though I was shooting weddings and I was doing commercial jobs or a commercial job, and I was making probably more money at that time from photography than I was my part-time job, I still wasn't really convinced that I wanted to be a photographer or knew that I was heading in that direction. I loved photography, I really enjoyed it, I was making money from it, but I was also going to uni to study graphic design. So yeah, cue my move to Manchester. Freshly 18, starting to see a little bit of movement in my photography career. I moved 200 miles away to Manchester and left kind of everyone I knew, all my contacts, everyone that I had grown a network around. I left that all behind, and I also left my part-time job because I worked in a park and you can't move a park with you. Moving to Manchester was definitely a shock to the system. I think for anyone moving away is a really uncertain and weird time. It throws a lot at you, especially, at 18, you're still like pretty young. I was definitely met with a lot of confusing feelings as to whether or not I'd made the right decision because of photography, because I was starting to realise that maybe I wanted to be a photographer and not a graphic designer, but me being stubborn was just like, well, I'm going to uni for graphic design, so I'm going to be a graphic designer. And I didn't want to kind of admit that maybe I'd changed my mind, and maybe I didn't want to be a graphic designer. I'd also obviously left my part-time job, so I was just supporting myself with my photography, which was in my head a great idea because I'd start making money with photography, but I hadn't really factored in the fact that I was moving to a city where I didn't know anyone, and how are you going to get hired if you don't know anyone? This was the point where I was starting to get more into portrait photography. Lots of my experience in London had been within like R&B, grime, UK rap, and I had struggled to find that scene in Manchester when I first moved here. At that time, the music scene was very heavily centred around like indie rock, and I didn't have any experience in shooting bands or anything like that, and I didn't really know where that left me, but I did know that I was enjoying portraiture. So I reached out to some modelling agencies in Manchester, which there are loads of. Notoriously, Manchester has a lot of modelling agencies. And the way I got into working with modelling agencies was that I would reach out to them, explain who I was, show them my work, and then I'd say like, let's do a test. So we'd organise a test, I'd shoot with one of their models, and then when they came back to me and said, we'd like to work with you more, I would then say, well, I'm kind of at capacity, I can't do any free work at the moment, here are my rates, and then they would book me. And so the first year of me living in Manchester was a mixture of doing that, doing like testing for agencies, like a couple of models a week at like a subsidised rate if they gave me like more than one a day, and then going home and shooting weddings for this agency. Along the way, I did manage to pick up like the odd commercial job, although I did do one that took 6 months to pay me, so that introduced me to the world of chasing invoices, which isn't a pleasant thing, but it's kind of like, I don't know, I guess a rite of passage as a freelancer. You just have to do it, and it's annoying and it shouldn't be that way, but at least I experienced that for the first time pretty early on. It was also around this point that I decided that I want to diversify what I was doing. I thought, right, I need to start maybe making some residual streams of income, passive streams of income. I had built a little bit of a following on Instagram, not a massive, like a couple thousand followers on Instagram, just from sharing my work. I think I got on Instagram at the right time, and they would ask me questions. It was like around the time that the question feature was first rolled out. They'd ask me questions, and I thought, it might be a good idea to make some Q&As and like videos, Q&A videos. So that's kind of how this YouTube channel was born whilst I was still at uni. I wasn't sure I'd ever really make money on YouTube, but I did know that YouTube would be a good way of engaging my audience, and maybe even like reaching a new audience. I also really wanted to learn a bit more about videography. YouTube forced me into that realm. This was before like short form content, so it was before like Instagram Reels and TikToks and stuff like that came about. And now as a photographer, I think you're kind of expected to do a bit of videography. When I'm talking about, that wasn't really a thing. It was like, you're a photographer, you weren't expected to do video as well, but it was something that I wanted to learn and I wanted to learn more of. So starting a YouTube channel definitely helped me there. It helped me learn a lot more about business and about video, about frame rates, audio, continuous lighting, music, marketing myself, structuring my ideas. Thankfully, nowadays there are a lot of tools that you can use that kind of automate a lot of those processes, especially with the rise of things like TikTok and things like Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. One of my favourite tools that I use is actually also the sponsor of today's video, and that is Epidemic Sound. For those of you who aren't already aware, Epidemic Sound is a platform that is designed for videographers and content creators who need to use royalty-free music within their videos. Whether that's for a client as a videographer, or it's for social content like YouTube and TikTok. One of their newest and most impressive tools is this new AI powered sound match feature, which really does simplify sound tracking. It really does automate that process for you. So if you're new to video editing or you're short on time, Epidemic Sound's Sound Match lets you go from a rough cut or clip to discovering the perfect soundtrack to your project in no time. And it basically works by analysing your video and delivering a curated selection of soundtracks that will take it to the next level. So you just play your video and you get a tailor-made music recommendations for each scene, which basically puts an end to that endless browsing for a perfect soundtrack. But utilising tools like these can really help to improve and speed up your workflow. Finding things like this, finding tools that do help you improve your workflow or design a workflow that works for you is such an important part of running any business, whether you're working as a photographer or a videographer or whether you're working in a completely different niche. If you are interested in learning more about Epidemic Sound and experiencing their Sound Match feature, you can sign up for a 30-day free trial with the link in the description. But delving into the world of online content creation brought a lot of new challenges and exciting opportunities for me. I found that I was beginning to attract clients through some of my more popular videos, and I also started to create courses for Skillshare, which is something that I still do and I still love doing. I actually, a little bit of a plug, just put out a new course which I'll link in the description. And the next 2 years was a balance for me, balancing my business and uni. I was still at uni. Even though I was fairly certain I did not want to be a graphic designer anymore, I still wanted to kind of get to the end of it, get my degree out of it. So I was balancing studying and finishing my degree with supporting myself with my photography. But it was at this point where I really started to delve into what should I be charging, slowly creeping up my price even more, learning my worth, I guess, and communicating with others about what is industry standard. I think also what ends up happening is, you end up getting more clients that come to you with their budget, and you can kind of work out from that what maybe you should be charging. I also started to develop long-term repeat clients, which really helped me out for a long while, having like that monthly income that you knew was coming in because there was a blogger you were working with every month or something like that. I also continued working with modelling agencies and shooting weddings. Although I did eventually branch out away from the agency, I started taking weddings on my own and being able to set my own prices, which of course was a massive financial pressure lifted, because then I was actually able to make some real money from photography, especially with weddings. I even ended up booking things like destination weddings, which meant that I was able to travel to places that I probably never would have even thought to travel to before. But during these 2 years, I definitely struggled a lot with the fact that I was still in education. I felt like I couldn't truly dedicate the time, the energy that my business needed because I had to finish my degree. And that was definitely a source of frustration for me. So as 2020 rolled in, I was counting down the days until my graduation. And 2020 was, of course, not the year that maybe we all had hoped and expected it to be. At the time, it definitely felt like I was graduating at the worst time ever in history, like that you could probably ever imagine graduating at, leaving that safety net of education, going out in the world as a freelance photographer, which relies on taking photos of people when you can't be near people, was a very difficult and very uncertain time for sure. So with the pandemic on our hands, the large majority of my photography work came to a halt. I was able to salvage some of the work by turning lifestyle shoots into product shoots. So where I was meant to be shooting lifestyle shoots for a bottle brand, for example, this is a real example, I was meant to be shooting this campaign for a brand that was making water bottles. Obviously couldn't do that. It was meant to be a lifestyle shoot, but I instead ended up shooting just product stuff. So I was able to shoot the product stuff at home on my own. They shipped the stuff to my flat and I shot it in the grounds of my flat and inside my flat. And I actually made a YouTube video about that. It was around this time I started to double down on my YouTube content because I had nothing else to do. And I made a YouTube video about doing that shoot, and that was the first the first video even, that kind of left the echo chamber, I guess. It kind of reached people that weren't already my audience from Instagram or whatever. I started to attract more product photography work, which was such a godsend during the pandemic. Being able to shoot products is something that was so great to do at that time because it was the only work I could really make. And then the rest of my time I kind of put into YouTube. I read a story once about a war, I think it was in the 1500s, where this guy who was had like an army, was going to like another country to invade that country. If you know this story and you know it better than I do, then I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. But yeah, this guy was taking his army to invade another country, and when he got there, he burnt all their boats, and basically said like, if you don't win, if you don't like conquer this country, you're like tough. You're not getting back anyway because the boats are burnt. And I kind of think about that a lot, and I think about it a lot in relation to going full time. I think especially if you're leaving something that is quite secure, so maybe that's the safety net of education or a full-time job, or maybe you're still living at home with your parents and they're able to, they have been able to support you, and then you're leaving. Anything where you kind of need to take that jump is really scary because it's uncertain and you're doing things on your own. I definitely found that in the sense that, if I didn't make the money, I can't pay my rent. Like I'm still living in Manchester, I'm still living there now, literally in the same flat. But like if I didn't make that money, I couldn't pay the rent, so I wouldn't be able to live here. Like I wouldn't have had that. And when you kind of have like no option, you have to make it work essentially. I think the pandemic in a weird way was like quite kind of like a blessing for me, and I don't mean that in the sense that the pandemic was a blessing or that I'm glad it happened. Of course I'm not, but just that period of time kind of taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about business. It taught me about having other income sources so that I'm not in that situation again if I was ever out of work. It taught me also a lot about creativity and about passion and about, if you really love something, when it's taken away from you, you love it even more, right? And that is definitely how I felt during that time. I came out of the pandemic with a stronger sense of purpose and a stronger sense of passion for photography, for what I was doing. That period of time where you can't shoot what you want, you can't create in the way that you want to create. When you are then able to, I think you feel stronger for it. And I think that period of time definitely did a lot in terms of reigniting my passion, which I think was I was maybe finding things a little bit monotonous because I wasn't taking time to shoot things for myself. Now this channel is basically just a whole channel of me shooting things for myself, learning how to shoot film and go into the darkroom and do all this stuff that I wouldn't have done beforehand because I was very much in the mind of this is my job. And I forgot that, once it was my hobby as well, and it's really important to try not to lose that feeling of being inspired and being a creative just because you're making money from something. So in the couple of years since, I've been making more of what I want to make. I've gotten back into shooting live music and on a scale that I probably would never have imagined pre-pandemic. Like I said, I've fallen in love with film photography and the process that comes with it. I've found a hobby again, and I've realised that just because it's your job doesn't mean you can't love it and enjoy it. I think a lot has changed in the way that I operate, both as a creative and as a business in the last few years. But I guess this is where I'm up to now, age 24, almost 8 years as a photographer, trying to make it as a photographer, I should say. I hope that the next 8 years I learn a lot more. I hope I become a better photographer. If I don't look back at the work I'm creating now and cringe a little bit, then it means I'm not growing. I'm excited for what the next 8 years, the next few years, the next 8 months, let's be honest, it has to hold. How much I'm going to change as a person. Got a lot to learn about life as well. How I'm going to change as a photographer, as a creative, as a business owner. But I think if at this point in my career I could give you some of the tips that I have as a photographer in the experience that I have had already, it would start with knowing your craft. Learn the basics, learn the camera basics, the exposure triangle, lighting basics, editing basics, all the stuff that's like the technical basics, but also learn what you're not good at. So for me, one of my pitfalls, especially at the beginning of my career, was studio photography. I've spoken before about how photography, especially studio photography, has quite a high barrier to entry. If you don't have the funds, the resources, the time to rent out studios, to rent out lighting, to buy lighting, then it's really difficult to learn how to use all of that stuff. And a lot of us, I think, end up working and learning on the job. I know that was definitely the case for me. Now that I am in a really privileged position, that I am earning the money that I want to be earning, I can put that back into my education. I can learn about things that I want to learn. I can take the time out to assist and shadow photographers and learn from them. A lot of that is why I kind of created this channel. You know, one of the videos that I did recently with Holly where I shadowed her in the studio, and she talked as well about how lighting, in particular lighting, studio lighting, isn't always accessible. Making videos like that, showing people how other photographers who I really admire work, is a small step to making things like that a little bit more accessible. Because it's really difficult. It's really difficult to know what you're doing when you walk into a studio. You've never used these lights before, and like there's no one there to, unless you've studied it or done a workshop, there's no one there to tell you how to do it or to show you. You have to just work it out, trial and error. And that's where practice is amazing, but practicing in the studio is expensive. You know, I could talk all day about that and about like the different barriers to entry that being a photographer or being a creative in general have. But yeah, I do think it's really important to understand where you're not as strong. Like, not everyone's going to be good at everything. You're going to have things in your career that you're not as good at compared to other things in your craft, and that is totally okay. But I think it's important to recognize that and to, I don't know, kind of try to develop that. And that's what I've been trying to do over the last few years, is develop my lighting skills, watch YouTube videos, watch Skillshare videos, learn from people, assist people, ask questions on social media. Like, we're living in such an accessible age in that sense that, you know, you literally have so much information at your fingertips. If you can take the time, if you do have the money to invest in learning, that is only going to make your career, you know, exponentially better. My other tip would be very similarly related to that, to knowing your craft, is to not stop shooting. You know, practice really does make perfect. Press all the buttons on your camera, understand your equipment, shoot everything and anything until you find something that you fall in love with, but also until you find your way of shooting. And then my other advice would be more like business orientated, and that would be about having an online presence, a social presence. And I will preface that with, you don't need to have an online presence to be successful. You know, some of the best photographers that I know have little to none, but I would say it is arguably harder to make a career without using social media. You know, it's free and it's at our fingertips. If you can use it, then please do. You know, show off your work, show off your personality. You know, portfolio and personality, those together creates something or someone who is hireable. Your personality is arguably just as important as your work. You know, be kind, be determined, be passionate. And I think you'll make something of whatever career, whether it's photography or something else creative or something else entirely. I think if you work hard, you're nice to people, and you put that time into learning, you can definitely make it as a photographer. But if you're looking for more general advice about freelancing, the business side of being a photographer, I do have a series on this channel. It's called Work Edition, and it goes through, you know, everything from setting up as a business, you know, should you be a sole trader or should you be a limited company? We talk about invoicing, we talk about how you make money as a photographer, you know, those bits that come with experience, come with trial and error, come with learning. I've tried to put as much of that information out on this channel as possible. But this video has been a really long one, the longest video that I've made in a really long while. But I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you find some sort of value from it. I really find it interesting to learn how other photographers have gotten to where they are in their career. I've got a long way to go yet before I'm where I want to be. I don't know if anyone's ever where they want to be, but yeah, I know that I've got a long way to go, but this is kind of where I'm at now, and maybe I'll make another video like this in another 8 years' time. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you hopefully in the next one.